Hey everyone, one last video. What is history for? That's the theme. I've been talking about this for a little while now. In this kind of class, we really have two related questions to talk about. What is knowledge of the past for? And what is knowledge of history for? History in the sense of conversations about the past. These might be subtle and tenuous distinctions for you at this point, which is totally understandable. I've mentioned it takes some time to really feel comfortable with that. In real life, as I readily admit, not all that important. And this is the last time that you really need to think about it just for the remainder of the video, at least until the end of the video when I kind of put them together, and then it doesn't matter at all. But let's look at knowledge of the past first. Why study the past? Why is having knowledge of the past useful? One of the most common reasons, you've all heard this in a million different adages, to learn from past mistakes, to learn what people did wrong or why something happened so we can prevent it or make it less bad. I'm not really into this as a motivation, to be perfectly honest. I've mentioned this before, so I'm not going to spend much time on it. In part because we've studied the causes of a lot of bad things, right? Of a lot of wars and genocides and labor abuses and exploitation and dictatorships and so on. They continue to happen. I mean, there's only so much you can really stop from human nature. Like, we're going to do horrible things to each other. I think that's pretty much a given. The question is, how do you sort of deal with it at the time? So learning to prevent things or learning from past mistakes as if you're going to sort of have a blueprint for the future, personally, I don't see it. If that motivates you to learn history, great. Keep reading. I hope you do great things. Another reason that I think is far more important, in a way, is the cultural value of historical awareness. William Stubbs, who we haven't talked about at all, wrote in 1877 that one of the great purposes of history was because it was an apparatus of cultivated life, and what it meant to be civilized, what it meant to be sophisticated, what it meant to participate in society was to have an awareness of history. And in general, I'm pretty wary of assigning cultural value to specific kinds of knowledges. There's lots of kinds of knowledges that are all valuable in their own way. So to say history is somehow better than other ones, I think is a bit pretentious. I think it's much more important to think about what you do with the particular knowledge. That's important. But having a sense of where you've come from, as a society or as a culture or as an ethnicity or sort of whatever group you want to put yourself in, or different groups and how they've changed over time, I think there's something very valuable to that. Cicero said that to be ignorant of history is to forever remain a child. You just never get outside of your own worldview. And that's very limiting if you're trying to affect the world in some way. Another reason to study the past, it helps us create and understand identities that are created or crafted through shared cultural memory. And I think what we understand, I think this is hugely important because it happens all the time, whether we like it or not. It happens in history textbooks that we're forced to read and exams we're supposed to take and college requirements for majors. It happens all over. Understanding how identities are crafted through historical narratives and how this influences cultural memory, and what we understand a common history to be, is integral to the idea of imagined communities, the idea of a nation. How do you have a nation if people don't share the same history, or region, or state, or city, right? The importance of a shared sort of cultural memory or history to imagined communities like nations is so important. Many of you asked, weeks ago we were reading Seven Cheap Things, and one of the chapters talked about how many of the chapters talked about how war is very important for resolving crises of capital because it facilitates so much capital flow to produce, tanks and bombs and whatever, and move people around and produce food and so on. War is really useful for bringing people together, something that's not really talked about in the book, but fits into the sort of historiographical narrative we've been working through in the course. All the petty social, cultural differences that we fight about, sort of in a day-to-day way without really thinking about it maybe too much, they go away, right? They become unimportant when liberty and freedom and safety and security are being threatened. When someone from the outside is attacking all these, issues, the domestic issues that plague any country, become totally trivial, right, compared to this other sort of existential threat. So people come together, right? This imagined community becomes less imagined. You're looking around saying, we need to be together, right? Forget that we were just fighting. It doesn't matter now. People like the Olympics for this very reason, right? Everyone sort of puts aside some of these local cultural differences and we all root for Team USA, right? That's sort of, I mean, a lot of people hate the Olympics for that very reason. We pretend like we're all getting along just fine, even though we're not. And on the point of having a shared cultural memory, studying history isn't just so that you can participate in what you consider to be your own history, but to recognize how others construct their own histories and their own identities and how they might see yours, and which would be, in many cases, very different from how you see it, right? Thinking about how they might be wrong about you can help you think how you might be wrong about them. And I think this sort of mutual sort of awareness of differences and different circumstances and different worldviews can be a useful starting point for conversations. So I'll say a little bit more about that at the end. Okay, why study historiography? How the writing of history has changed over time, distinct from the past, conversations about the past. So I'm always tempted at this point, the final kind of lecture video thing, to do a summary of content and sort of step through all the different stuff we've been reading to kind of remind you and put it in front of you. I don't want to do that here, okay? I do not want to talk about Herodotus and Thucydides and their pursuit of historical truth. Not that they got to it, but that they wanted to pursue it, right? I'm not going to talk about Livy and Cicero and Tacitus and Roman historians who were trying to understand the cycle of history and Rome's sort of destiny to be on the pinnacle of civilization, right? The following Christian fathers, the church fathers, who wrote universal histories to bring, everyone under the umbrella of the Christian history, the Christian church, and account for these different sort of cultural groups under sort of a larger umbrella. I'm not going to talk about medieval chroniclers who were documenting deeds of popes and kings and regional sort of rulers to solidify their power. Renaissance humanists later, glorifying antiquity, trying to restore the glory of Greece and Rome, ad fontes, going back to the source, a new approach, a new critical approach to history, in which they want to understand how much they can trust sources, where they're coming from, how do you read them critically, what's the real history, right? Sort of reinventing history in a way. Enlightenment philosophers, I'm not going to talk about any of this stuff. Universal histories, right? Trying to bring everybody under this sort of Western Europe narrative, just like the Christian church fathers were trying to do, but a very different sort of cultural framework to fit people in. 18th and 19th century romanticism, sort of this yearning for a past simpler time, sort of stepping back from industrialization, saying, can't we go back to, Greece and Rome, and this idea of antiquity and creating this sort of harmonious world. 19th century scientific history, Ronca and his disciplines, this very nationalistic history that tried to differentiate these different nations that were emerging. Early 20th century, shaken by World War I, then another World War. How do you explain the causes? How do we understand? Why couldn't people predict this? What does that mean about the progress that we were supposedly enjoying as a species? Postmodern history in the 60s, especially the 70s, and continuing today, decentering of historical truth, inclusion of more voices. I'm not going to talk about any of that stuff. What do we take away from this accidental list? What do we take away from a historiography class? A study of how people have written about history. What are we supposed to do with that? You can look at that list I didn't give you. History has always been for a lot of different things, okay? That's pretty obvious to us at this point. It's constantly changing to suit the times, right? It's always people at different times, different people with different methods, writing in very different styles for very different purposes, but they're always doing the same kind of thing, which is using the past to justify, explain, critique the present, and chart a future. All of them. History, therefore, is constantly being rewritten as the world changes, as culture changes, as new voices enter the conversation, as old ones move out, different kinds of people come into the conversations, new interpretive frameworks, new theories about how the world works, right? 7 Cheap Things is a theory about how the world works. You reject it, accept it, doesn't matter. That kind of stuff, that kind of use of history is constantly happening, constantly changing as time goes on. I hope that kind of awareness, it should seem totally obvious after this class, and maybe it was even before, but especially now, I hope that kind of awareness helps inform how you read all histories from now on, to understand how it can fit into a larger historiographical context. Another thing I hope you can take away from the course is how it can help us reflect on the relationship between history and national identity and politics. I mentioned this a second ago in terms of war and imagined communities and so on. And it's everywhere all the time. Just recently, some of you probably read about this and know more about it than I do. In the news recently, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell is trying to have the 1619 Project, you know something about that. He's trying to have it removed from any federally funded curriculum because it promotes revisionism, that's his word, of U.S. history. Mitch should take a historiography class, because the one thing you learn in this kind of class is history is always being revised to fit the times. All history is revisionist history. We're still writing about ancient Rome. We're still imagining it in different ways. We're still correcting things. We're still revising things. We're still reinterpreting things. People 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, if we're still here, they're going to write about ancient Rome in a different way. It's always being revised. There's no accurate history that just kind of gets built up and then distorted by outsiders who have some weird political agenda. That's just not how history works. McConnell said the 1619 Project and programs like it strive to reorient U.S. history away from their intended purposes toward a politicized and divisive agenda. Can you give an example of anything we've looked at in this class that hasn't been, in terms of history, that hasn't been politicized or that hasn't had an agenda? Every footnote to every history book in this entire class of all the books we've read are history books that had an agenda. And whether you classify them as overtly political or somehow sort of, tangentially political, that connection is there. In terms of the 1619 Project, I'm not going to go over, all the stuff that we already have. But the debate isn't really about the history. There's some specious claims that the project makes about, did the founders want to sort of protect slavery in the Constitution and so on. Those kinds of debates aside, that's not really what's driving support or opposition to the project. The debate really is about what is the outcome of the project going to be? There's just fundamental disagreement about that. Is it going to expand our shared cultural memory? Is it going to get us to think about and include other people's experience in our own perception of our national history? Or, on the other hand, is it going to get people to think about their own histories in their own ways and then sort of shut off from other people? Is it going to unite through cultural heritage and shared memory, or is it going to divide? Depends on how it gets used, right? It's not really up to the project itself. It depends on how it gets used. But the debate really is not about the history or the interpretation or whether it's reorienting or not. It's about what's going to happen as a result. It's another voice in the conversation, right? It's another perspective. In general, we like having multiple perspectives in history, right? We like knowing the different points of view, the different options, the different ways of creating narratives. There isn't one right way. And this is one of the key lessons of looking at historiography, looking at history being written and revised time and time and time again, literally throughout time. No one is right. Who's right about the 1619 Project? Nobody's right. There is no right. There is no right history. And I point this out because people often argue about sort of something like a reorienting of history in like the 1619 projects or Confederate monuments or architecture and so on. They argue about the history. 7 Cheap Things is another example. People argue about the history and say the history is really bad, which, I agree. But they use that as a way to say something about the project when the actual impact of the project, like 1619 or something else, isn't really about the history. It's about what we agree or disagree history is for. Should we all embrace the same cultural narrative and have lots of different diverse opinions and experiences as part of that? Or should we have these very discrete ways of looking at it that are all separate, right? But in order to understand history, we have to look at them collectively. How do you teach those? Those are very different philosophies about how you teach history, about how you create an imagined community and cultural identity. It's one of the reasons I love historiography. It's not just about sort of how historians have written about the past. It's a debate about how we use history and its role in our society. I think that's pretty cool to think about. The upshot to all this sort of political stuff, history is always changing. History is always political. Read generously and critically. 2 more points. I hope this kind of course encourages you to think more critically about your own conception of history, kind of building on the last point. We started this class talking about default settings. I think one of our default settings is that we tend to think about history as stuff that happened in the past. And there might be some, arguments here. There are some debates about, what date did this happen? But it just keeps increasing. We just keep learning more about the past. We just keep learning more. And of course, there is some aggregation of knowledge. We are learning more, for sure. But really, instead of just thinking of history as just gaining more knowledge about the past, we have to keep in mind that really it's lots of different conversations about the past. Different people join those conversations. Different people drop out of those conversations. Different kinds of people get to participate in the conversations. The things that seem interesting to us didn't seem interesting 50 years ago and won't seem interesting 50 years from now. I said all this before, but I want to make sure I get it in one last time. With all these people coming in and out of the conversation, and the fact that postmodernism has made clear that there is no absolute truth to history. There's things that people agree on, there's things that people sort of debate about, but there's never really a right answer because the point of history is to use the past to understand the present. So we're always revising, we're always reinterpreting. So there's no absolute truth, even if we can agree on a lot of historical facts, right? The truth and interpretation is more fluid. Some people are unnerved by this because they think that means there's no truth and that people can interpret history however they want, including in really inappropriate ways. That's not necessarily the case. That's a kind of historical nihilism that says, if there's no truth, then everything is valid, history is fiction, and so on. No, let's not go there because that's not the case. History is about evidence and argument, right? Whether there's truth or not doesn't change the fact that good history is whatever the topic is, whatever the time period is, good history has evidence and argument, and you can evaluate how good something is, or how right it is, or how true it is for that time, based on how that time period uses arguments and evidence to say something and interpret it in a sort of semi-agreeable way. Okay? So Holocaust deniers, people who think we faked the moon landing, or 9/11 was some government conspiracy theory, these are not valid historical interpretations, right? Just because there is no absolute truth about history doesn't mean everything is equally valid or potentially true, right? There's no convincing evidence at all for any of these sort of crackpot theories. So we don't have to worry about, the idea that people can come up with whatever theory they want about history if there's no single right answer. But I think understanding that there isn't an absolute way of understanding the past and that it's constantly changing. I mean, that's what historiography tells us. First and foremost, it's always changing. And we want it to change, right? That's what makes history useful. If it was just aggregating knowledge about the past, which unfortunately is how many of us learn it in grade school, right? Here's the textbook, here's the information, learn it. And that's what it seems to be. And of course, what history really is at sort of a broader cultural level is these changing conversations. And to understand how they come and go and why, and how they shape what we know about history and how it informs our sense of cultural belonging and our own identities and so on. I think it's crucially important for civic society. And speaking about civic society, transitioning into my sort of last section here, what is the value of studying history in both senses of the past and sort of conversations about the past? What do you get from a history major? I guess would be another way of asking this question. I think it's extremely pragmatic and useful because it trains us over the series of courses. Every one history course does this, maybe not this one actually, but it trains us to evaluate disparate, contradictory, confusing evidence in its context, right? Historical context, obviously, but that's what every history class, that's what every any good history conversation tries to get you to do, is understand how to evaluate the evidence in its context, synthesize it into a narrative that makes sense and explains it. That kind of thinking, that kind of skill, that kind of process intellectually is very important, because anyone saying anything interesting about the world, I made this point in my very first video and I want to make it one last time. Anyone saying anything interesting about the world is synthesizing and interpreting information, just like you do in any history book. Synthesizing and interpreting information. So learning how history works, seeing it, reading different kinds, different historians, different time periods, topics, geographies, seeing the different lenses and methods that historians use to analyze this kind of information. And I'm speaking at a meta level here. This isn't about a particular time or place or geography. It's about synthesizing and interpreting information. The things you learn through history and seeing historians do it in their books is something you can do with any kind of information, right? It helps us understand the motivations of people who have given you something, some information. What are they looking for? What are their biases? Why are they doing it this way? What kind of stuff are maybe they leaving out? How do I understand what else is going on that isn't right in front of me, right? Understanding the limitations of the information, right? That's what historical source analysis is all about. What are the limitations of what I have? How seriously can I take it? How do I cross-reference it with other stuff? The more history you read, the better you get at sort of understanding how this process works and how to make a convincing argument. And that's a really powerful skill, no matter what your career, no matter what your job is, to take a lot of information that's confusing and contradictory, synthesize it, make sense, and convince someone here's what it means and here's what we should do. So that's why you should be history majors. Two more things, kind of related points. It's actually one last section of the video. Two distinct but overlapping points: metastructures and diversity of experience. Two more big picture, bird's eye, satellite views of why study history. History and historiography provide awareness and perspective outside of our own short lives. I mentioned the quote from Cicero earlier. Study of the past helps you understand how things got to be the way they are. And it helps us recognize all these structures around us that govern us and influence and guide us every day, right? You can't solve problems in the world. You can't even talk about them productively if you don't have a sense of how they got to be the way they are. Otherwise, you just have these blinders on and you really you miss too much information, right? History will not tell you any answers. We've already gone over that. But it prompts very important questions that the present simply can't. History helps us be aware of other circumstances outside of our blinders, right? It helps us question things we wouldn't otherwise question. Relatedly, understanding historiography, how history changes over time, the conversations, it helps us decide what do we want to pay attention to. We've seen how historians have decided to pay attention to different things, right? They've decided to ignore things, fit things into different kinds of narratives at different periods of time. They've used history to create a world that they want to live in, that they thought was the best world. Seeing this happen in history, seeing this happen in the study of historiography, helps us understand that we're always doing this every day, right? Not in terms of writing history, obviously, literally, most people don't do that. But we're making these same decisions. What do we want to pay attention to? What do we want to ignore in our lives and how we're trying to shape the world around us? What decisions are we making? As David Foster Wallace put it in the very first stuff we did in this class, this was a long time ago, critical awareness of self and circumstances and a great ability to exercise control over how and what you think. And it's not just about thinking about history, but how you see the world and people in it. Bottom line, there's literally a line at the end of this paragraph, and that is the end of the class, that's the end of this video, and we're all done. Bottom line, knowledge of history, both macro and micro history. We've seen that the value of having both of these views and different scales of history as a way of sort of aggregating information. We can see very clearly how we need both, right? Just one misses it. We've talked about this in the modeling history, right? The macro data scale versus the micro sort of humanistic, empathetic scale. We need both. Knowledge of history at multiple levels helps us ask not just how's the water, but to recognize the boundaries of the water. You start to recognize your own fishbowl, right? And how that different groups of people who have had similar life experiences, and it's not just about income, socioeconomic status, skin color, age, education. I mean, you can find a lot of demographic variables and they all matter to some extent in different ways. But when you have someone who in aggregate has had a similar upbringing, you're kind of in the same fishbowl. And you start to recognize that all the fish around you and the water, you sort of share this worldview, and it seems like all there is, right? But I think studying history gets us a sense of that there's lots of fish bowls. And so you levitate out of your fishbowl. This is going to get a little bit too metaphysical maybe for the end of a semester. Levitate out of your fishbowl and see the other fish bowls, right? You start to recognize other people with very different experiences in their life, whether because they were born a mile apart and geographically it mattered, or they were born 1,000 years apart. You start to get a sense of what other people's water is like, right? You start to be able to ask, not just, how's the water? How's our water? You start to ask, how's their water? What do they see in us? What do they see? What do they look when they look over here, right? To be constantly mindful. I think history, more than any other discipline, helps us be constantly mindful of other people's very different experiences that lead them to see the world and value different things and hold it just as dear and just as tightly as we hold our values. And when we look at theirs and say, why do they do that? We need to make sure we can turn that question on ourselves. We need to look at our own water and see their water and vice versa. And we start to see the world that way, maybe we can sort of bring all these fish bowls together a little bit. I think that would be pretty cool. Thanks for the 16 weeks, everyone. I've really enjoyed reading all your responses. I'm not just saying that. You wrote a lot. I was on UNM Learn all the time. You guys wrote too much. I'm sorry about that. I hope it helps some of the questions that we thought about in this class stick with you. I hope you continue to ask a lot of questions. Really, thank you for your time in this class. I wish you way more than luck. Take care. We're reifying a lot of the ways in which we were. A lot of people, not all is it for. We all kind of embrace this. I hope this kind of course encourages you, and there is some aggravation. Conversations about the past constantly changing to fit so that we. There can be definitely at the end of the semester.